Welcome to the Developers Who Test podcast, a podcast for developers who embrace test automation so they can ship better quality software faster and have more fun doing it. Today we're speaking with Adam Sandman about the risk-driven development and software testing. Adam is founder and CEO of Inflectra, a company that helps enterprises in regulated industries scale critical software delivery with speed, quality, and low risk. He's also a prolific conference speaker and has spoken at Star East, Star West, Agile Testing Days, Eurostar, and others. Today's episode of the Developers Who Test podcast is brought to you by Testery.com. Whether you're a developer who has just a handful of tests or even thousands, then your tests deserve to be running on the fastest and most reliable platform for open source testing. With AI-driven insights and analytics, unparalleled parallelism, and awesome integrations, Testery enables you to get more from your tests. Check us out today at Testery.com. So welcome to the Developers Who Test podcast, Adam.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on the show today. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Cool. Yeah, glad to have you. So it's been said that a rational business focuses on three things, and those three things are increasing revenue, decreasing expenses, and managing risk. And so I kind of wanted to start the conversation with, why do you think businesses should care about risk?
I mean, risk is an interesting topic because it tends to be the lurking demon that bites you when you're not expecting it. So companies can plot a projected curve of revenue, expenses. They're very predictable KPIs for a business. I mean, you can look at the macroeconomy, look at your inputs, look at your outputs, do customer surveys. You can usually plan sort of a trend-based analysis of what the year will look like. Risk is something you didn't expect, and it can be completely disruptive to your industry. Look at any company that's been disrupted, whether that's a company like Blockbuster or Redbox or people involved in making cable television that have been disrupted by streaming. In any industry, there's the risk that someone wrote on a board that say, well, if the internet gets fast enough, we don't necessarily need this, or if people start doing this in a new way, we won't need the other. And those things typically get shunted in a corporate board meeting down the list. And we're instead focusing on, yes, I know all that stuff, but what we can control is cost. We can control revenue. We control sales margins. So I think as a human, we tend to forget the risks that are going to be there. And as you said, it is one of the key critical success factors in a business having longevity. It also requires a lot of I think mental agility and determination to understand risk and not become, I think, obsessed by it, and also to understand and measure what is the impact, what is the probability of something happening, and being able to take measured, structured, financially viable ways to protect against it. Because there are risks that there's no protection against, and so a business has to understand this is an unmitigated risk. Let's just hope it doesn't happen, and there's nothing we can do. And there are things in life that are like that. And then there are other risks that you'll come across in development and in software engineering where you have to understand what is the likelihood of something happening, what is the impact if it happens, how do we plan for it, how do we mitigate it. And I think businesses often don't want to spend the money doing that when there's more tangible things you can spend the money on with more immediate ROI. So I guess it's the ROI deficit. How do you measure the value of a risk mitigated when it didn't happen? Insurance that you paid for that you never use. We all buy life insurance. We hope we never use it. We all buy disability insurance. We hope we never use it. We understand there's an ROI on buying that insurance. It's a bit like insurance for business.
Yeah. So where do you think a software tester comes in when it comes to managing risk within an organization?
Well, it's interesting you say that because software testers in particular really have been doing this for a long time, but we just didn't call it that. So if you think about software development and testing, someone builds some code, there's test scripts, there's exploratory testing. At some point, we have to decide, when can this software ship? And typically, the tester is not the person deciding that. It's the product owner, let's say. Product owner has to decide, when can we ship this software? And if anyone listening to this podcast can tell me, when did you ever ship software with 0 bugs? Never. So you ship it with some bugs, and some bugs are acceptable. Presumably, some number of bugs are not acceptable. Some types of bugs are, some types of bugs are not. Some test failures are acceptable to go live with, and we'll mitigate them later. So the job of the tester is not to decide what's an acceptable level of risk. The job of the tester is to explore the risks, present to the product owner or the decision maker who's going to go live with a product. Here are the risks if we go live. Here are the risks if we don't go live. And there are risks in both categories. And presenting that is what testers do, so that the product owner or other decision maker in that particular organization can make a rational, informed decision when does going live present the least risk to the organization. And people will sometimes say, well, what's the risk of not going live? Well, it's all the time. You have a version 1 that's out there with some security holes. We're going to fix that with some fixes. Well, those fixes have potential side effects. So keeping version 1 on the market is a 60% chance of someone being hacked. Going live with version 1.1 takes that down to 10%, but there's a 20% chance of a side effect that could break the application. Do we go live? And those are the kind of decisions that testers are helping to inform, and product owners have to ultimately take the accountability for.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this is a challenge that increases as you get into larger enterprises, or do you think it's something that everyone faces? And the reason I'm asking that, is, I'm imagining if you've got a larger enterprise like Microsoft and they have to decide, are they going to ship a new version of their operating system? The consequences of not patching a software vulnerability for them could be very huge, but at the same time, they might have extremely large downstream customers who depend on their software working the way that it originally worked before
I
the
mean,
issue.
it's a really interesting question. I don't before I answer the question, I mean, this is a real scenario. I remember, and this may be dating myself. I think it was Windows Vista. They had a lot of updates that they were pushing because it was a major security holes, and they did brick people's machines. I remember there were some updates that they had to back off because the first recipients of that Windows update. Sorry, Microsoft, I'm not picking on you. This happens to all of us. Bricked machines and prevented critical functions from operating, and they had to roll it back. But if you don't roll that update out and there's a security hack, then of course you're vulnerable. And Microsoft has such very complex systems with lots of people depending on it. I would say the complexity definitely makes it more difficult to understand the risks of doing and not doing. I think the principle is true for anyone. If you have a small startup business and the risk there might be indifferent, it might not be a cyber attack, or it might not be the risk of side effects. What it might be is I can go live with this product today, and if I do, it's going to be a 90% MVP that's going to be reasonably okay, but it's not beautiful. It's a little flaky. Users are going to see it and hate my product. I could wait another 6 months, but my competitor's nipping at my heels with another startup, and they're going to launch before me, and I'll be obsolete. So between those two extremes as a startup business, you also have the same idea of risk of releasing, risk of not releasing. When is quality good enough? When is risk reduced for your particular context? That going live today is more important than waiting tomorrow. So I think it's germane to everyone, but I do agree that when you talk about these large complex organizations or big complex systems like power plants and hospitals, another good example is there was recently a cyber attack in the UK in hospitals, I think like a week ago. And hospitals are traditionally always very vulnerable to cyber attacks because they don't update their software very frequently. And that's because they have to do all this independent testing by law, which takes time. And so you have this, unfortunately, one imperative is stay updated. On the other hand, the other imperative is do no harm, make sure you test everything. And that's at odds with each other. And so I think, unfortunately, it's again a situation of quality, risk, and speed. You may be trading off quality for risk, and maybe the balance isn't right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. I never thought of how, being able to test your software more quickly could actually result in a situation that saves lives. If you're dealing with updating healthcare software and, getting the new version is going to have positive outcomes for people. That's really interesting.
Well, you're right, because by law, if you operate in a hospital or actually a power plant, one of our customers, without mentioning their name, is a utility. In utilities, you're not allowed to deploy software, commercial software, without testing it independently. So you could get Gmail or Outlook or something, particularly something that's installed. I don't know about web apps, but maybe even web apps. You can't just say Google or Microsoft has done a very good job of testing it. We're going to deploy it because there's a bug in it or a security hole. We have to independently, as a power company, which is not our job, test this software, same as hospitals. So therefore, being able to test that faster using automated testing and modern testing techniques means that the correct hospitals can save lives, power plants are less vulnerable, there's less outages, there's been, versus cyber attacks against pipelines or against power plants. We know those are vulnerable targets to hackers. So for sure, it is a It is a life-saving endeavor, testing.
Yeah, it seems like one of the challenges here is how do you go about assessing risk? Because as humans, it feels like we're not very good at that. We fear all of these things are going to happen, and one of the most dangerous things that we do is get on the highway and get in our car every day, and that could actually be a pretty dangerous activity. And yet somehow we're comfortable with that level of risk. But then we're afraid of, getting on an airplane where statistically it's so much safer than the highway we drive every day.
That's a
So
really good
in
point.
the
Yeah.
software world, like what would you recommend we do to make sure that we're assessing risk correctly there?
Right. It's a great analogy, and it's very similar. And I think I'm one of those people who doesn't like. I do fly a lot, as you probably know from work and all the conferences I
Mhm.
speak at, but I never loved it. But um, there's two main factors in risk, and there's a third one if you're doing with manufacturing. There's probability, how likely it is, and then there's the impact. And I think as humans, we tend to focus on one more than the other. So obviously, just take the flying example. Flying, statistically, it's much less likely that there'll be a plane crash, much less likely than a car accident. But if there is one, the impact is almost always catastrophic. There are very few, there are some, but there aren't many survivable plane crashes. Whereas, in theory, though there are many car accidents all the time, whether it's true or not, you perceive the impact, literally, of being lower. The
Mhm.
speed is lower. So, the impact of being in a car crash, in theory, cognitively, you feel lower. So what we do in risk management theory is you multiply these two together to try and normalize those. So you take the probability, how likely it is, what's the impact, multiply it. And I haven't done this for travel. I'm curious if you did it for all modes of travel, and you apply that and compare that to our cognitive understanding. That might change how we feel because people always say air travel is safer. Well, they're saying statistically, they're saying probability. Have they factored in the impact of how many people die in a plane crash versus in a car of just four people? So it's interesting to think about that. It might
Mhm.
change how we actually measure those two if we applied formal risk theory. So in software, it's the same thing. You have a bug, or you're actually not sure if it's a bug. It's just really a risk. We know there's some part of the application that we haven't had time to fully test. Let's imagine that because we didn't test that section, what's the worst thing that could happen? And let's say it's the admin screen. The admin screen that you change some obscure settings. That screen completely blows up. It's completely unusable. Does it matter? Well, that screen is used statistically by 0.5% of the user base on a weekly basis, as
Mhm.
opposed to another screen in the application, which is the gateway to the entire app. It's the main menu. It's the login page, authentication. It's some low-level service that if it goes down, the whole app stops. A bug there is going to break the whole app for everyone 100%. So the impact is lower. And then the second part would be in the past, we've changed this part of the application. What's likely it's going to break? Is the code pretty good? It's modular. Oh no, this is the rat's nest of terribly written code. It's all, you know, monolithic code that we don't want to touch. And if we touch one thing, it always breaks. Probability wise, we know there's problems. So you look at those two dimensions, and it's the same as the airline and the car. Understanding the risk of not testing it thoroughly versus the time you're now going to spend not being able to test something else. Because ultimately, the time is fungible. Whether it's automated tests or manual tests, there's only so much time to test, and you've got to write automated tests. You've got to make sure they're not flaky. You've got to potentially refactor them. Manual tests, there's only so many hours in the day. If you test A, you're not testing B. If you're focusing on A, you're not focusing on B. So understanding risk helps you prioritize what time will reduce the most risk in the new release you're pushing out, rather than just saying, I must test everything. If I don't, we're going to wait, which isn't feasible either.
Mhm. Yeah, so that's interesting. I feel like the naive approach is you should test everything every time.
Right.
But it seems like you're suggesting, well, in some cases, there's a risk associated with testing everything every time. Maybe you're not able to complete the amount of testing that you need to do in a specific time frame, and that's delaying a fix, and that fix could be critical.
Right. I
Uh,
think, and I think when people say we want to test everything every time, but they don't really mean that. They might mean I want to touch everything every time, but they're not necessarily testing every permutation of data, every edge condition. If you could do that, then I think you then just do well, and you can do it in the time frame with the resource you have. Then presumably, why not do that? But
mhm,
realistically, you're not doing that. Realistically, you're saying I can touch the surface of everything, and therefore that's good, as opposed to if I touch a little bit less of everything, but can go deeper in a few areas where I think there's more risk to be investigated, then maybe the outcome is overall a higher quality system. And I think that's the other thing is people focus a lot on testing. What we should be focusing on is quality, which is, I think, aligned with risk. A
Mm.
high quality system is one where you've mitigated the technical risk of the system. And thinking quality is often more important, I think, a different way of thinking than testing. And it always bothers me when people say, oh, I'm a QA tester, because in the industry, we've kind of taken QA is not the same as testing in manufacturing and outside of software. QA is QA, and
Mm.
testing is testing. And testing is a function you do to help understand the quality of what you're doing. But QA and quality assurance is a much bigger discipline that starts right at the beginning with the requirements, the user stories, the planning, the training. And then if you look at the software world, we often pay short shrift to that stuff.
Mhm.
Oh, you don't need the Amazon training course on cloud. Just figure it out. Don't learn best practices on the latest version of C# or Python, whatever language you're using. Just go on Stack Overflow and figure out how to do it. So we short in a QA world, we'd say, what is the quality of investment in time in that training? Will it yield 10% less bugs down the road?
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of like, I always find myself falling back to construction analogies here,
Mm-hmm.
but it's kind of like the difference between the home inspector who's supposed to give you some kind of assurance that the home that you're about to buy isn't going to fall apart the second you move in.
Right.
And then there's the person who's the actual builder who worked on the house, and they have all of these tools they use along the way. They use a tape measure, they use a square, they use
Mm-hmm.
a level, a plumb. And these are tools of the trade that they use to produce a higher quality result. And it feels almost like sometimes we're asking testing professionals to just only be the home inspector and
Mm-hmm.
like, don't worry about, the unit tests that have to be done or the integration tests that have to be done or the improvement in the requirements that needs to be done to produce a higher quality result. We just want you to look at the finished product and tell us, does it work or not?
Right, and that's why in the construction industry we have things like permitting, and the government has gotten involved and said, well, actually, if you're going to use wood for this house, we have to
Mm.
make sure the wood meets these standards. People that are going to be working on it have to be permitted and licensed, and you have to apply for permits. And a lot of that's to make sure, like the architect and the architecture meet standards. So if you took that analogy to software, the government isn't yet, and I say yet because if you look at some what's going through the European Union, and maybe software development and the software
Mm.
lifecycle will start to become regulated, truly regulated, which is, I don't know if it's a horrifying thought, a terrifying thought, or a good thought, but the governments of the world are starting to wake up to the fact that so much of our nation's infrastructure and international infrastructure relies on software that's written by people who don't necessarily have any formal training. We just, we started a business and it grew and it developed and it was good. Open source projects that the entire world relies on. They always have that there's that picture of like the entire world digital economy resting on the shoulder of one guy working from home on like one logging or
Mhm.
open SSL functionality. It was like great diagram, like one person on a chair, like the entire world sitting on him. And we let that happen, and we wonder why we don't have high quality. It's the same
Mm.
thing. But is the government going to get involved? And that's a scary-ish thought because then you're going to have rules and regulations rather than quality, which doesn't necessarily promote quality either.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it certainly gets pretty political pretty fast, and this isn't really a
Mm-hmm.
political podcast.
Right.
But it is an interesting thought. Like I'm thinking of supplier risk management, right?
Right. Right.
That's another form of risk management. Is this idea that if you're creating like let's say you're Johnson and Johnson and you're creating shampoo bottles, and
Mm-hmm.
you get the bottle from one company, you get the chemical that you use in the shampoo from another company, you might get the cap from a third company. And they're always talking about, what's the risk of all of our suppliers? Do we have diversity in the suppliers? Or are we getting all of our caps from one place? And, you don't typically see that in terms of, when we're assessing software projects and we're looking at all of our dependencies, are we getting all of our dependencies from the same place, or are we getting it from multiple places, and how established are they?
It's
And I think
interesting you
that's,
say that. And that's changing.
yeah.
I mean, we're a software company that builds a product. We're not a service company, and we use third-party components, grids and UI toolkits and various other controls we bought over the years. So we build the core product, but there are libraries we buy and libraries that are open source that we use because it makes sense. Someone solved this problem. We're not a UI toolkit company. We're a testing and project management company. But we've started, and this is new. We've started looking at suppliers who give us the software, and we're looking at what are the ISO 29701? Are they SOC 2? Where is it developed? With geopolitical risks, where's it developed? We do have to care about that now. Ever since SolarWinds, the supply chain injection type attacks, I would say that maybe 4 years ago, you got a library, the developers looked at it. Did it work? Was it bug free? Were there regular updates? That's probably not what you cared about. And beyond the fact that it did what it's supposed to do. Now we put them all through a third-party risk management framework.
Mhm.
I think that is probably the future to some degree. Software is an essential service, and it's starting to be treated like one. We do work in the life science industry, and in that industry, even though we're dealing with software, not with shampoo or medical devices, but because our software is used in a company where they're going to be using it to manage embedded software, which can be used on like a pacemaker or a heart monitor, we have to be validated to the same level of standard as a Johnson and Johnson. We have an annual FDA audit we have to pass as a software company, and they look at our requirements matrix, they look at our testing plan, they look at our risk matrix, and they want to make sure, do we have a developed software testing plan, and how do we do testing? What's our quality manual? So they assess us on our quality practices as well as our testing. And it's not just the finished product, it is the process they audit as well. And we also do work in aerospace and automotive, which are very similar. I see other industries starting to potentially take on that as well. So I think as software professionals, we're going to have to understand the language of quality, not just the language of testing.
Yeah. Now you've got me imagining a world where there's some standard that has to be followed that says code coverage should be above a certain percentage on unit tests, and unit tests have to be there. Like, do
That's
you really think that's where we're headed? Are
I
we
mean, for
there
life
already?
sciences, well, for life sciences, we're there. We literally give that's literally what we have to report.
Hmm.
Well, in life sciences, the way it works is usually, do you what do you say you do, and do you say what you do? So
Mhm.
if you say we have unit tests and we intend to have them all pass, then you have to do it. Now, you could say, as a standard process, we have no unit tests. That's actually okay. The
Hmm.
key is just basically a lot of these ISO standards are not so much prescribing what you do. It's merely have a written process for doing whatever it is you do. So if you're a startup business and it's a brand new MVP and it's the first version, and if no one buys it, no one's going to care if the next version works anyway, then your level of quality is very different. And if you think about engineering quality, fitness for purpose, the fitness for purpose for a startup, B2C e-commerce site is not the same as someone who's building maybe even a startup biotech company. So I think the measures of quality will be different, and that what's in them will be different. But the idea of having a measurable standard that you define that you're then measured against, that might become the industry norm. Just
Hmm.
knowing that that standard may be different, but the concept will be the same.
Mhm. Cool. Yeah. So let's say I'm a testing professional and I'm interested in getting started with knowing more about risk-based testing and
Mhm.
rolling it out in my organization. Where's a good place to start? Uh,
That's an interesting one. There's not a lot of good information. So we as a company have someone in our team who's very passionate about risks and risk management and always has done. He comes from the biotesting environment and patient systems. So that's where he kind of brought that ethos with him.
Mhm.
And we when we rolled out some of our new functionality, wrote some of our white papers and blogs. There's not a lot out there. There is some on Google. There's some white papers. We have some stuff. I don't want to promote our stuff, but there's definitely people talking about it. But it's become kind of an emerging idea. There's not a lot of people really compared to everything on automation AI. You go to any testing conference, there'll be 90% AI now. And two
Mhm.
years ago, it was all codeless automation. And I think risk-based testing and risk management is sort of underappreciated. So I have to think about where to go. There's definitely some websites I could dig up, and I can give them to you to pass on to your
Mhm.
team and to the audience. But in general, Google searching, we have some stuff. There's the PMI has some information on it. Those are some of the best places. It's not dealt with as much as it should, I suspect, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, so I don't just mean what to research, but
Oh,
like let's
okay.
say you're wanting to take the first action inside your organization to lead change to introduce risk-based testing because you think that this is the kind of thing that you should really be doing. So, like let's take, for example, you brought up maybe we can't run every test every time.
Hmm.
And so the team is really getting a lot of pushback of, hey, we need to run all of these tests. And oh, by the way, we're not going to increase the size of your team. We're not going to invest in automation. It's still on you to figure out what needs to be tested. So maybe somebody's in that situation and they're wondering, okay, I think risk might be a good way to prioritize this.
Okay, that's really helpful. So in that
Yeah.
situation, what I probably would do is first of all look at your backlog of user stories that you have. And that could be not just the stuff that's in the current version, but your historical user stories. Look at the functionality you have, and then brainstorm what are the possible risks that you could have in the system across the board. And um, in my talk on risk-based testing, what I talk about is it's very easy to get fixated on one area of risk. So typically looking at like technical risk, there's conceptual risk, technical risk, will it work? Conceptual risk, even if it works, is it the right thing? Do people going to use it? Then
Hmm.
there's schedule risk. Then there's other types of risk too. That could be legal, privacy. If you go online, you can probably find a list of about, ask ChatGPT, about 20 different kinds of risk you should be looking at. Get that on a board, a virtual whiteboard or a physical whiteboard, and have the team brainstorm in each category. What are the top 5 risks, technical risks, top 5 conceptual risks, top 5, programmatic, legal? You'll come up with a probably a set of about 50 risks. Maybe you get to 60 or 70, and then do the exercise where you rank them all by priority and and then impact. Then you'll have now a ranked list of risks, and then basically just map those back to the individual parts of the system, and then map them to your tests. And what you might find is that some of those tests are really going to drill down and cover a lot of that risk. And there may be other parts where you'll say, well, nothing's telling us. We've got no way of knowing if that risk is really there or not, manifest or not. We need some new tests. So what it will probably do when you go through that exercise, you'll find there's a whole bunch of tests that are covering this whole one area of the system or this whole one area of risk. And we got that completely covered. And maybe they've never ever failed, or if they do fail, we don't care as much. There's this whole area down here that we haven't thought about. So the danger is it may increase the amount of tests you have to do initially, but it may give you a larger test list. But then you can start to prioritize them by saying, okay, these are the most exposed risks we have. Let's start with these tests, get feedback. And so that would definitely give you a way to potentially prioritize. There are some other tools on the market which can do some clever things like look at your code base and scan the code base and see whenever things change, which tests fail. So there are some tools out there that can make some, heuristic guesses as to where problems would be using the risks from previous failures. If you're starting out, you probably haven't got enough data on this, and it's probably too expensive to set that up. So keeping it simple would just be build out your risks, map it back to your user stories in your backlog, look at your test plans and your current tests, understand how they relate to the risks, and then just prioritize them based on the risk score, which is the probability and impact combined. And that will give you at least a good handle on if I've got 100 tests to run, from top to bottom, the top 30 of those will reduce the most risk. And do that and see what you find. If you find that one of them fails, maybe you want to go a bit deeper on that and find out more what's going on and not worry about the lower level ones, because that's what you might find is that that one failure is you
Mhm.
pull back the onion, or the layers of the onion. You're like, oh my goodness, it's a can of worms. And
Yeah.
sometimes we used to do that. We used to label bugs with like a little icon of a can of worms because we knew, like, oh no, we don't want to deal with this. But we knew we had to. But that was kind of the thing. You knew intuitively that there's a can of worms in some of these areas, and so
Yeah.
exploring those would be valuable as a tester to understand all the realm of what should happen.
What do you say to the folks who think that uh, so in a lot of the DevOps world now, the focus is really on Dora metrics,
Right,
and those are really about how quickly can we deploy something to production? If everything breaks, how quickly can we recover?
right. And then
And so I
the
see a big
defect metrics
emphasis
too. Right.
on observability and just get something out into production, observe it. If it fails, roll it back, and you're okay. Uh, do you think that that's helping us address risk, or do you think it's increasing the potential risk that
Well,
could happen?
it's an interesting philosophical question, and I mean it's the whole shift left, shift right. So shifting right, so you can monitor it, you can observe and monitor in production, and shift left for a second. Digress for a second. Shifting left was actually about finding risk. Shift left said we're going to do some quick tests where we find problems. We know where we need to spend more time. So if the system used to run at X%, now it's 20% slower. My unit tests are 20% slower. I probably introduced a performance issue, so my shift left will tell me, let's spend more time doing a performance analysis. If I find one security hole in the API that's new, I probably do more security testing. So shift left said, let's look for areas of risk. So in theory, shift left reduces risk. Now, when you go to shift right, which is observability monitoring, if you can roll back and recover quickly, it actually reduces the impact of something happening. So it is
Mhm.
risk still. It's go back to that Windows example from the Vista days. It was hard to roll back that update in those days, and so the impact of Microsoft pushing a very bad update was potentially catastrophic level of impact. But now, when you use Windows Update, just for example, many times now I've had a Windows Update that's caused issues. You can undo the update and Windows recovers, which is pretty incredible that Microsoft can do that. But as a result, the risk of a bad update is now lower impact. Doesn't mean the probability is any less. So I would say if you can truly recover from production into and roll back into a stable state and undo the introduced risk, then the risk of introducing changes is lower. So I think the DORA metrics are very helpful in that regard. The only, I guess, the issue would be, can you introduce something into production that even though you might roll it back, the business impact might still be severe? Like
Mhm.
you push in a bug into production that there's those cases where the entire systems have come down because some performance issue was added into a critical service and it caused a cascading failure and the entire system went down, like in the stock exchange. And so, yes, you could roll it back, but you've lost, X hours of trading, and every second of trading is a $10 billion fine or
Mhm.
$10 billion in lost business. Um, or a cyber attack can get through a door. So, oh, I rolled it back. Well, it's too late. The malware's already in. I mean, it's sort of a.
Yeah.
So, what's the cost? So, I guess when people talk about the rollback, are we fully measuring the cost, the true business cost of recovery, or reputational risk? I don't know. So, I think
Mhm.
certainly if you can truly roll back and it's safe, then the risk of missing something is lower, and it lets you push things into production, and it means that the risk you can accept a higher risk going into production. That whole question of should we go live, I think
Yeah.
you can accept a higher risk.
Yeah, I feel like it feels to me like it's an 80 or 90% solution where,
Right.
90% of the time, this approach of observability, feature flags, quick rollbacks really helps you out. So you introduce an issue, you find out about that issue quickly, you roll back. It was low impact, as you say. And so, from a risk management perspective, you've done a good job of it. And because of that, it lulls us into this false sense of safety that we don't need to do all those other things that we used to do to manage risk throughout the process and create a good result because we can just turn off the feature flag, rollback will be fine. And
Right.
where I see folks getting into trouble, like we put together once a year, we do what were the big failures of the year
Mhm.
in the software world, and you look at a lot of those, and a lot of them have to do with obviously hacking, so bad actors, or they have to do with configuration changes, which are difficult to unit test. So you have to
Right.
put eyes on it after you deploy, typically. Or they deal with, a lot of complex event driven moving parts. And so in a lot of those cases, the bug that you're putting out there might actually be there for a while and be difficult to roll back. Yeah, the other category is data changes, right? So if you
Mhm.
have very big sweeping data changes, I was working at a company that was doing big data analytics,
Mhm.
and at one point we were processing 2 million records per second in
Wow.
terms of events coming in through our system. And there was a bug that made it into production, and we introduced new code to fix that bug. It was a multiple month process to reload all of the data because we had to backfill all of the data that had been loaded before with the new version. And there was somebody babysitting that process along the way. So when you talk about what's the impact, fixing that bug was somebody babysitting a process for 2 months, and now it pushes the project back 2 months. And
Wow.
it's really easy to think about, oh, you can just roll things back. It's not a big deal. But if you're dealing with, terabytes or petabytes of data, and the defect that got introduced is causing that kind of mayhem, it might not be an easy thing to just roll back.
Right. Right. Or it rolls back in one environment, but right. What was the downstream impact? In this case, the data had to be reloaded because the bug had affected the data that would be produced. It was no longer valid.
Mhm.
It sounds like so. The data itself, the outcomes were all invalid.
Yeah. Yeah. So I like that you're bringing up a risk based approach to, what kinds of tests you write and where you spend your time on the tests. It sounds like it's also just what should your testing strategy be at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
So depending on the kind of environment we're working in and the kind of risks that we anticipate and the impacts that we think they'll have, maybe exploratory testing is or isn't worth doing. Maybe fully automated testing is or isn't worth doing. Maybe feature flags and rollbacks are or aren't worth doing. So it seems like this is kind of a framework that we can use, not just for prioritizing our tests themselves, but what kinds of tests we should even be doing.
Well, even development, risk-based development, and the idea that if you're going to build a new feature, if there's risk in this feature, make sure the developer puts a feature flag in. I mean,
Hmm.
it's all very nice to say, "Oh, it went live. We wish there was a feature flag." We didn't think it was necessary. Is it? Do you put that in every feature? Is it certain features? Maybe you add feature flags as a sprint. Maybe you find all the high risk areas and add feature flags so that you can potentially do proactive rollbacks later. I mean, there's a lot of it is how can I take my current application and just think about how to reduce its risk right now? Decoupling things, microservices, things that reduce the risk of one failure cascading, and dependencies. I think also one of the things I've also noticed is software testers and developers unfortunately don't often look at the system in the same way. So there's a risk there. One of the talks I gave was on software architectures for testers, and it came about because I remember we had a release of one of our products, the help desk tool, where to the developer, there was one bug that affected one bit of code. To the tester who was looking at the external surface, 6 different screens were all broken. Now, what the developer knew that the tester had no way of knowing and would never have known was that there were some common features across those 6 pages that had been refactored into one common module. So even though it looked like 6 screens, it was really one screen, and so one bug was truly there. So the developer's like, it's only one bug, it's not a big deal. Tester, 6 screens out of 50 are down, it's a big deal.
Hmm.
They're both right. And it was only once we actually went through a diagram of how the code was put together, how the not so much the core stack, but how the different modules connected and the layers and what was reused in which places. Then we had a common language that the testers and developers together went, oh, I see now. So when I changed that line of code, I should have realized it would affect 6 places. So the impact of my change was huge. And the tester would understand that when the developer changed one thing, looked at the code commit, and it's one line, and couldn't understand why 6 seemingly unrelated things had all broken. Because the
Mhm.
problem then is it gave the testers less confidence in the system because they saw one commit, one line change, and they're thinking like, well, there's obviously something else going on. There's other weird broken stuff. Their level of confidence in the release was much lower. And whereas the developer just said, it's one line, I get it, I'll fix it, it'll all be back. So it's a lack of language and a lack of common terminology
Mhm.
and an understanding of how systems work can often hamper that communication and collaboration.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point that's worth pausing on here a bit is the influence that architecture has on risk as well as our approach to testing. And I think that's, we talk about, should you have an ice cream cone shaped testing strategy or should it be a pyramid shape or
Hmm.
should it be a trophy shape? And I think sometimes we lose sight of the reason that those models came about is very heavily influenced by the architecture that you have under the hood.
Right.
So if you look at how software was built when you and I got started in development, which is let's not date ourselves, but was a little while ago.
Hmm.
uh, it wasn't uncommon at all to put database calls inside of there were ASP pages, JSP pages.
With the embedded SQL embedded in the GUI. Yeah,
Yeah,
right there on the
you'd
page.
have SQL embedded in the GUI. And from a testing perspective, that essentially means you really can't do proper unit testing. You have to do end-to-end testing. And when you make an individual change of, like, let's say you want to rename a column in a database,
Hmm.
right? Uh, an architecture that's properly designed can isolate that change so that
Right.
if I'm renaming this column, there's only one API in the entire system that reads that table, that reads that column. I update the one line of code, I run the test for that API. Everything else that depends on me is fine.
Right. And the
But
service
if
layer isolates the database structure to the
yeah,
as well. Right.
yeah, and in the world that we grew up in, if you changed that column name, you had to read your entire code base and search for that column name in, it might have been 100,000 lines of code or more to find all the places that it's used. And then from a testing perspective, we had to kind of test everything. And I think that's why over time, because we're getting better architectures where we're moving towards microservices, We're having layered architectures. We're seeing the testing shift from now it doesn't need to be as heavy on the end-to-end to you can integration test APIs, and then you can unit test modules and components. And so now we're getting a new testing approach. But I think it's interesting how risk ties into that it was really the potential impact of a single code change is all of the different places that can be impacted by that code change, and that's risk. And if architecturally you can kind of guarantee that your change is isolated to a specific component or unit or layer, the more you can contain that change, the more you're limiting the risk of that change negatively impacting something else.
But it's interesting, when you think of risk from a development standpoint, it can sometimes make you do things that are counterintuitive in architecture without going too into the weeds. But so there are times when we're at the end of a sprint, and we've got to release this, we've got to get out by a certain date, and we need to make a change. And we look at the change the developers are going to make, and instead of making it in a common shared library, which is used by lots of things, we need to make a change in one page. And so what we sometimes might do is we might decide to make a change that's only in the one page, even though that's against architectural best practice, which is to have use the generic function. We'll branch that change because even though that's less architecturally correct, because you're now creating duplicate versions of something, we're worried that the side effects of changing it for every consumer of that service is more than we have time to test. And what we might do is we might make the change in one isolated area and branch it off and make it like a copy. And then when the sprint is over, we're not under the time pressure, we will go back and refactor it. But we're making a very intentional choice to make a worse architectural decision in the short term, knowing that it reduces our testing risk, so that we can then refactor it when we don't have the time pressures, then we know we can build more regression suites and automation, and then redo it later. So we're actually doing the work twice. And we've done that many times where, even though logically this is a worse coding style, worse architectural practice, it reduces the risk for that next release intentionally.
Yeah, so I think what we're hearing here, folks, is the pragmatism that comes with experience. We all start with that beginner's mind where we follow the rules and we don't quite understand why. And then over time, you understand why the rule was there and why the rule wasn't there. So what we're seeing here is a fine example of someone who's really experienced, the ins and outs of risk and testing and how to roll out better software. So, Adam, really appreciate having you on the episode. Before we end here, I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, you're a prolific speaker and speak at conferences. What have you got coming up where folks might be able to see you in action?
Well, I've got one in Australia in August. If you are in Sydney and you want to join the Testing Talks conference, that's in August. I'll be there in person. And then the second one, which is closer to home, I'm going to be speaking at Star West in Anaheim, California. I'll be giving a talk there on AI and is GPT-4 coming for my testers? And if so, how can I adapt? So a little different topic, but happy to be there and talk about that.
Awesome. Yeah, such an awesome topic. And I know that's top of mind for a lot of folks. So really want to appreciate having you on the episode. Once again, this is Adam Sandman, the founder and CEO of Inflectra, and we've been talking to him about risk-based testing.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. Have a great day, everyone.